To be sure, I am passionate about many things, but today my passion is focused on finance, on numbers, and on the intricate puzzles of our organizations and institutions, which have to balance so much in order to provide benefit to the communities we serve. And so, without further ado, my first good idea of my life. No, just kidding. My first good idea is that your financial statements are not just making a statement, they're telling you a fascinating story. Listen to that story. When I teach classes on reading financial statements, I always say, you already know so much about your organization, and the numbers are just another way to tell the story. But let's start with your financial statements. And financial statements are not just a budget sheet, not just a report that provides income and expenses and a bottom line. For example, tell me if you can ever see how much money you have in the bank by reading your budget report or your income statement. You can't. You can have surpluses on paper that look huge, but really there's no money in the bank. That is possible. And why is that? One simple answer: the balance sheet. The balance sheet is the hidden gem of any organization. It tells you how you are doing financially from the day you opened your doors until now. It tells you how much money there is in the bank, who owes you money, who you owe money to, and how much you've accumulated in reserve from the time you've begun. So one tip: don't overlook the balance sheet. And if you don't know how to read it, make sure there is someone you trust in the organization who does. It's key. And what is the story that your financial statements are telling you? Well, besides reporting on whether you have a surplus or a deficit, whether there is cash in the bank, or whether you are into your bank loan, your financial statements tell you what your organization's priorities are. You can see how much you're spending on program costs and whether those program costs are for trips to the park with daycare kids or hygienic supplies for the elderly. And the story they tell should make sense to you. For example, if you as a board have decided that after completing a strategic planning exercise that you're going to change direction and start to invest in youth in the suburbs, then you will want to review the next few sets of financial statements and see that, in fact, your spending on programming in youth programs has increased. If you notice a decrease in that line, it would seem out of step with what you know your organization is doing. Basically, what good idea number one really means is that your financial statements should really resonate with you as reflecting what you already know you are doing. My second good idea: the budget doesn't really budge. Within its fixed frame, the details paint the picture, and the service is all about the spending. Don't be afraid to spend. What am I trying to say here? First of all, that the budget is the budget is the budget, and you cannot budge it. The budget that the board approves before the next fiscal year is the budget that you should expect to see on every report thereafter. We as staff can't just go and change a budget that the board has approved. That cannot fly. There can, and in fact I would say should, be a process to reflect on how close the budget is to reality. Many changes happen in our organizations. In fact, a target or projection should be assessed quarterly, but it should always be compared to the original budget. And I can't tell you how many times in teaching classes, students have confessed to me their discomfort with their organizations, which may use one budget for internal purposes and present a different budget to a certain funder, and perhaps a different budget yet again to a different funder. Don't do that. First of all, it's really hard to keep track of who you told what to. And the other reason is that the budget is really your tool. It's what you want to come back to every quarter or every year to say, how good a prediction did we make and why? Within its fixed frame, the details paint the picture. So we already know about the fixed frame because the budget is the budget and it doesn't budge. But what about the details? Why are they important? The details are really about how fine can you tune it. Remember, the budget is your tool. I've worked in many places sat down with many a manager and pored over the details of their program spending. Sometimes I find pizza in the travel budget. And so I ask, why is pizza charged to your travel budget? And they say, oh, that was pizza we had for a workshop with teenagers. Remember those youth in the suburbs? And our workshop line was full, but we had room in our travel budget, so I charged it to travel. Well, you can't do that. First of all, pizza is not a token, it's a pizza, so let's be accurate. Second of all, if your budget is a tool and you want it to work for you, why not let workshops be overspent and travel be underspent, so that when you go through your budgeting process next year, you know what your real spending is. And you need the details. When the finance person reviews the details of your spending and writes the report to the board and says, our workshops with youth in the suburbs are overspent, the board is going to breathe a sigh of relief, because they will remember that the numbers are supposed to tell a story, and they will remember that they plan to do more work in the suburbs, and so those details, the overspending on pizza for workshops for teenagers, will actually make sense to them. The service is all about the spending. Our jobs in the charitable sector are a lot tougher than in the private sector in many ways. For example, in the private sector, bigger is better, more really matters, and it's all about the bottom line. Well, in our sector, there's a bottom line too, but it's not about making the bottom line bigger. To measure success in the for-profit sector, we look at the bottom line, and if it's really big, if the gross profit margins are high, if profit margins are high, then we say the corporation is successful. In our sector, the way we are measured is by how well we are providing our service. And the way to provide service is by spending. No donor is giving a donation to the organization so that the organization can feed its bottom line. Donors give money to organizations so that they can spend it in providing service. But our job is doubly hard because we can't overspend. Donors, funders, foundations, they're all pretty sophisticated readers of financial statements. They know how to look at the balance sheet to see if there's money in the bank, and they know how to read an income statement to see if the organization has overspent its budget. So it's kind of like a game show. Who can get as close to zero without going over? Another word I'd like to add here, don't be afraid to spend. In the same way that we want to get as close to zero without going over, we don't want to have such a fear of overspending our budget that we don't take risks, we don't invest in, say, infrastructure or new program areas. Spending is not just the best way to provide service, it's the only way to do it. My third good idea. Government regulations and related business, charities are often caught between a rock and a hard place. What does this mean? Well, as many of you know, times are kind of tough for charities right now, and they seem to only be getting tougher. Government dollars are harder to get. We often find ourselves up against the private sector to provide services, and we can't always compete. We may be unionized, or we may have less efficiencies of scale. As government turns away from block and grant funding and into a fee-for-service basis, charities are finding themselves sometimes left out in the cold. And now government funding is often tied to outcomes, which is not a bad thing from the government's perspective. They want to make sure their dollars are being put to good use. But from a charity's perspective, sometimes a lot of work can go on with our clients, and they still might not turn up in a job that they hold down for a few months. And therefore, the charity does not get paid if we are being paid for outcomes and not for services. And so it seems we are being asked to operate more and more like a business, but here's the catch. Charities cannot run businesses except under the strictest of guidelines. I used to think somewhat naively that as long as all of the charity's profits went back into the charity, then it was okay to run a business, but that is not so. The rules for related businesses are laid out on Revenue Canada's website, and I have provided it here as one of my references. It's complicated to read and understand, but I do advise you to read it. And here's one thing I know for sure. If your business is run by all volunteers, you're okay. If your business is run as part of what you do, such as a training program, let's say for youth in the suburbs, then you're okay. But if, for example, you are on a board and someone comes to you with an idea for how your charity can get into business and make money, make sure it is going to fly with Revenue Canada first. Remember that one of a charity's most important assets is its charitable status. You don't want to put that at risk, even though your business idea might be a great one. My fourth good idea. Administration costs are nothing to be ashamed of. We don't walk on water and we don't run on air. Every charity likes to boast about its low admin costs. I find myself wondering, why are we trying to outdo each other on this? Shouldn't we get very brave and say, actually, our administration costs are 20% or 15%, and in that way, we don't punish those of us who are at that level. Not every charity is large enough to get economies of scale. The smaller charities will have higher admin fees, and they will have to suffer for it. Revenue Canada itself allows that charities will incur up to 20% administrative costs, and yet the norm in everyone's head seems to be that anything above 10% is excessive. And another thing, just for the record, there are many ways to classify costs, including administrative costs. For example, I belong to a group of CFOs in the city with a very illustrious and creative name. It is called the CFOs of the NPOs. You can't get more creative than that. It is, as its name applies, a group of financial folk who work in the nonprofit sector. We've had lots of long, fascinating discussions about many things, including the administrative cost discussion. How do organizations account for their CEO's time, for example? How do organizations account for their phone bills, their rent? My favorite thing to think about in this area is the lowly paperclip. Think about it, a paperclip. It's an office expense, right? Therefore, it's an administrative cost, some might say. But think about what that paperclip does. It's attached to papers that talk to teens about self-esteem. It is handed out in workshops that prepare kids for what to do when they encounter bullying. Those papers are handed out by youth workers in a program for youth in the suburbs. That paperclip is clearly a program cost. And so, my point, there is more than one way to account for many costs, paperclips included. Next time you hear that an organization spends more than 10% or more than 15% on its administrative costs, hold the judgment and remember, we don't walk on water and we don't run on air. And my fifth and final good idea, let us be your carbon offset. Smart money cares about a multiple bottom line. You may have heard about the double bottom line or the triple bottom line. The first bottom line being profit, of course, or in our sector we would call it surplus or deficit. The double bottom line has been used at times to measure performance in terms of positive social impact. There is the triple bottom line, or 3BL, measured as people, planet, and profit. A fourth bottom line has emerged recently, measuring sustainability. In many ways, the nonprofit sector has been ahead of the curve from the start, at least in terms of the double bottom line. We have always cared about the positive social impact while making sure the agency achieved a surplus to survive. These days, the planet is on everybody's mind, especially for those of us building supportive social housing. We are using green technology, ensuring green roofs. The project I'm currently involved in at YWCA Toronto will have no less than 3 green roofs and use geothermal wells to heat and cool a 300-unit building. Nonprofits are in some ways unfortunately sustainable, and while it would be wonderful to imagine a world without violence against women, for example, we haven't evolved to that degree as yet, so women's shelters are unfortunately here to stay for the next foreseeable while. That said, we can be positioning ourselves in relation to what I call new money. It used to be that charities received grants and businesses were invested in either through debt or equity. And yet charities have a viable, sustainable, people-centered, well-managed business model. Why not have charities attracting equity or debt? Clearly, the ways that businesses have been able to use debt to leverage their assets could work for charities. New money is thinking in new ways for charities. There are examples of patient capital loans, that is, loans with a long principal payback horizon. There are examples of community bonds or social impact bonds. In England, there have been some fascinating partnerships with government to cut, for example, recidivism of those doing short-term prison sentences, one at Peterborough Prison in England, about 2 hours north of London. Right now, about 60% of prisoners in that category reoffend, costing the state money in policing, court costs, and prison operations. Simply put, if that recidivism figure drops, the government saves significantly. To address this, creative investors pooled $8 million to fund 3 local charity groups, which will offer mentoring and drug counseling, among other things. If they meet their target of a 10% reduction in recidivism, investors will get their money back at between 7.5 and 13.5%. Right here in Canada, foundations are beginning to target a certain percentage of their capital base to do mission-related investing. This mission-related investing doesn't look for carbon offsets outside of the scope of the foundation. It allows Canadian charities working on sustainable people and planet-focused work to be the foundation's local carbon offset. I look forward to living in a new money world, and I give thanks for the privilege of working in the sector that really does put meaning into meaningful work. Thank you.